Hi, my name is Renee Kapp. I'm Curator of Education here at the Art Museum. And it's really wonderful to have these very talented and resourceful women here today. This exhibit is part of our 5th grade program. And man.
I was waiting for it. We're gonna let you work your way out of that.
This exhibit is the core of our 5th grade program. So every morning we have a 5th grade class. It's Rajesh Shimamura, the Minidoka, on my mind, and about his experience as a young boy in a Japanese internment camp in Minidoka. And it's given us an opportunity to work closely with the fort. And it's been wonderful to have Carol's book as a resource to help us understand this experience. And Jason has graciously agreed to moderate this discussion. So thank you for coming and enjoy.
Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Jason Main. I'm the new Curator of Collections at the Historical Museum of Fort Missoula. Very pleased to be participating in this event. The fort has a very unique role in internment history in the United States, as we will see in the course of this discussion. So I'm very pleased to be here and very pleased to see that we have such interest in the community. This is really wonderful. Before we get going, we're going to give each of our guests, our panelists, an opportunity to introduce themselves and talk about their work a little bit before we get into the discussion. But allow me to give them an introduction here just before we get going. Diane Sands. Diane has served in one capacity or another in the Montana legislature for nearly 30 years. Her experiences... Is that a little better? Okay. Her experiences have taken her from political activism in Washington, D.C. to the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula, where she currently serves as our Director of Development and as the resident authority on the fort's alien detention camp history. Diane has been actively involved in promoting and attempting to preserve Fort Missoula's internment history, most recently acting as the point person in the museum's acquisition of the former post headquarters building, which contains the original ADC courtroom at the fort in an acquisition process from the Forest Service. So, welcome, Diane. Carol Van Valkenburg. Carol is a professor of journalism at the University of Montana School of Journalism. She is a native of Montana and has received both her bachelor's and her master's degrees from the University of Montana. She has also worked at the Missoulian and the Philadelphia Inquirer. Carol is the author of really the definitive history of the alien detention camp period at Fort Missoula. It's a work entitled An Alien Place.
And that book will be being signed after the presentation. In the corner and you can put
Development at work. And of course, Teresa Tomorrow. Teresa was a staff photographer for 20 years, moving from small weeklies to the Los Angeles Times and eventually to the Seattle Times. She has taught black and white photography at a private preparatory school in Sun Valley, Idaho. She served as a photo editor for an internet-based environmental news service. And she's also studied as a Freedom Forum Asia Fellow in Hawaii and Japan. Teresa began teaching photojournalism at the University of Montana in the fall of 2002 until she left the faculty in 2006. She has a Master of Fine Arts in Photography from the University of Washington and continues her work on a photo project, a documentary of people, places, and objects connected to the Minidoka Internment National Monument in Idaho. So please join me in welcoming these distinguished panelists. So if we can begin by having our guests give a brief description of their ongoing work. Teresa, do you want to start? Okay.
Hello. Welcome and thank you for coming out on a rainy day. I put together some photos of this ongoing project, some of which are displayed downstairs and in the lobby. I hope you've had a chance to look at them and maybe read the captions. What I'm going to do first, I'd like to get to know a little bit about all of you, and I'm wondering if you could just raise your hands if you've been to one of the 10 relocation centers. Okay, have any of you been to Minidoka specifically? Okay, so not very many. So this will be a chance for you to see a few pictures from the site. I'm also wondering how many of you learned about the internment camp as students in school? Okay, thank you. Before I show the photos, I want to do one quick exercise, and I'd like everyone to close their eyes and imagine that you've just been told that you have to leave your home. You don't know where you're going or how long you're going to be gone. You can only take what you can carry, and you have to decide what you're going to do with the rest of your possessions. You can't take any pets. And you might have a day, some of you will have 6 days, and some of you may have several weeks. What would you take? It's a tough decision, and that's what thousands of Japanese and Japanese Americans were forced to do during World War II. Let me pull up my pointer here. All right, the Minidoka camp was located here in Idaho. It's about 20 miles northeast of Twin Falls, and the closest town is called Eden, but they referred to it as Hunt because that was the postal code, because there's another city by the name of Minidoka that's located over in this area. This is a map that the Minidoka post office gives out to people to find their way to the camp because there's no signage that will locate it. And because my family grew up in Idaho, they did not have to relocate. It was just this area that was considered the military zone, restricted zone. And so people who were in Minidoka came from Washington, Oregon, and the territory of Alaska. And this is a little schematic of the layout of the camp. There were 12 barracks in a block, and there are 36 blocks. And so there is also a mix of administrative buildings in there. Okay. Edward Tsutakawa chose to take his art supplies when he left his home in Seattle, and he did a series of drawings and paintings which showed the conditions and surroundings. He was a founder of a sister city program in Spokane, Washington, with Nishiomiya, Japan, and they built a beautiful Japanese garden in Manitou Park. If you've never been there, it's really a gorgeous place. He died in 2006, and they added his last name to the name of the garden. June Otami took her violin, and she brought the Suzuki method of learning how to play the violin to Idaho. I grew up with her siblings, my siblings and I grew up with her children, and none of us knew that she had been in Minidoka. And it wasn't until 5 years ago that I found out while photographing another couple. They told me about her. Robert Hosokawa took his typewriter. He was an aspiring journalist and had just graduated from Whitman College, and he was recently married. And when his wife became pregnant, he wanted to get out of the camp so that his son would not, or his child, he didn't know it was his son, would not have to be born there. And with the help of a Whitman College professor, he was able to be released to work in Independence, Missouri. And I just thought the irony of that was pretty good. So I have a picture of his ID card in the exhibit downstairs, or in the lobby there. Tak Toto took her record player, and her barrack was one of the most popular places to go. And she was only 16 and a junior in high school, and she decided to leave to go be a nanny in Toledo, Ohio. So she left her parents and took care of these little girls. And how I found Tak was through my photo professor from Idaho State University. His niece was married to Nan's son, and this is Nan, and Nan now lives in Portland. So it's been interesting how I've been able to track some of these people through kind of odd ways. Takashi Hori used to own the Panama Hotel, which is this building behind. And if any of you read the book On the Corner of Bitter and Sweet, you would recognize the name of it as it's featured in the book. He allowed people who were in the Seattle area to store their possessions in the basement, and many of them did not return to pick up their items after the war ended. So the basement was full of things when the new owner, Jan Johnson, purchased the hotel. And she saw the historic significance to it and kept it there. She's opened a little tea house in the lobby, which anyone can go to and have coffee or tea. And she cut a hole in the floor and has a little display area where you can look down and see some of the items that were left. There on the left is what you'd see looking through the hole. but from above, and then on the right are just some of the objects. I didn't see any paper parasols there, but mostly kind of common everyday objects that people thought they would need again when they came back. This is a photo from the National Archives. In 2005, I was a National Geographic faculty fellow and was able to go to the National Archives during my free time to go through all the records about Minidoka as well as the photo archive. And this was taken in August of 1942 from one of the water towers by a government photographer by the name of Francis Stewart. The barracks are still under construction even though the people were starting to arrive by that point. This is a picture of one of the few remaining structures still there, and it's the most visible one because it's right next to the road. It's part of the waiting room, and the chimney and the walls are made of basalt, which is quarried from the area. This is a barrack that's on the Idaho Farm and Ranch Museum. They paid $5,000 to move it there, and this is a kind of a replica of the setup. It's a 20 by 20 apartment, and the only things that were there for the people when they arrived were cots and then these coal stoves that's kind of back there in the corner. They had to make their own furniture, and so they would scavenge this scrap wood to make various items, and these are children's chairs. And you can tell by the wood on the back of the barrack it matches the chairs. This was donated by an anonymous person to the Jerome County Historical Museum, and they're displayed now in the I-Farm barrack. Arthur Kleinkopf was the superintendent of schools, and I had taken this picture in Twin Falls at his son Jerry's home, and I found out from one of the students who had been in Minidoka in 1943 that he was a much younger man than this picture, so I included one from the yearbook which shows him as he was at that stage. But he kept a diary of his employment there, and his wife Edith typed up the 600-page document, and it's bound and available for people to read in the Twin Falls Public Library. And his nephew Kent is here with us today, and he's on the board of directors for the Montana Historical Society. I don't know if any of you were here when Roger Shimamura spoke in Missoula, but he was asked a question from the audience about the teachers at the camps. And he was saying that some of them weren't all that good, but what I heard from some of the high school students is that this woman, Helen Manning, was outstanding, and she was really responsible for many of them to go on to college and leave the camps early. She died this year and kept in touch with many of her students. She told me that Minidoka had the highest rate of students going on to college and special schools. I saw this picture in the last yearbook that they had, and I was struck that they had a Spanish club. There were 160 members there. And I thought it was great that this man, Mr. Phillips, this is the only year that he was in a yearbook, had the foresight to start this. But what got me even more was when I was at the National Archives and I saw this photo, and I thought, wow, that's really photography's unique aspect of selectivity and what you choose to keep in the frame and what you choose not to, and how those galoshes really show what the conditions were like there, which are taken out of the other picture. I included this just to show you the conditions of the camp. This is in the winter, and it was when it was first opened, and so they didn't have the sidewalks really built at that point, but it was, you know, very dusty and muddy there, and that's what everyone always remembers. This is a copy photo from the Minidoka Interlude, which was kind of a yearbook, but it had pictures of all the residents in their blocks, and they had this little layout of the Spud Cellar, which was built in 1943. It's another structure that's still there, and I took a picture of it in 2002. It was kind of really dilapidated, and since the National Park Service took it over, they've since shored it up and got it, you know, kind of re-roofed, so it looks a lot better than it does in this picture. This man, Mr. Kogita, who's over here, he took a willow plant with him when he had to leave for the camps. And he started this garden. He also would take plants that he found out in the desert and move them in. But he created this incredible rock garden. And when the camps closed, he had all these huge rocks shipped back to his home in Seattle. And so his son, Paul, has them on display, and he created his own rock garden out of them. This is like a chimney lava rock, and it's hollow in the center. And they estimate it weighs like 2 tons. It's huge. And it was also mentioned in a book called Defiant Gardens about gardens during World War II. Their father made this table. He was a carpenter, and I just thought it was a really beautiful piece. It's made out of bitter brush, which they would find out in the desert. And this is a Yonsei, or fourth generation pair. Emily Momohara's on the left. She was a student of Roger Shimomura's. She's now an assistant professor of photography at the Art Institute of Cincinnati. And Anna Tamura, she's no relative of mine, but she's on the right. And she just finished her graduate degree when I first met her. She's a landscape architect with the National Park Service. And for her thesis, she did a survey of the site to show what was still remaining there. And in the time that I've started this project to now, Anna's since gotten married, and she now has like a 2-year-old son. So I feel like I need to hurry and get it done, because her son will be getting married and I still won't be done. I wanted to include this picture because many people try and find the site, and there's no interpretive center there. There's now some signage which will give you some information and background, but you have to go to the Jerome County Historical Museum in Jerome to really see some information, and they have a complete collection of the Minidoka Irrigator, which was a newspaper produced there. And this display I thought was kind of a funny one with the Caucasian mannequin, but you know, it's completely volunteer, and I respect their efforts in just trying to provide some information that really isn't available yet right now. And this is my closer. It's of the only signage you'll see about the camp on the road, and it's right before you turn. Like if you go down this road, the campsite is just beyond that hill. And I love how it says Prehistoric Hunters Hunt. But the name Hunt is either an explorer who used to camp in that area, or Wikipedia said that Hunt comes from the name of one of Idaho's governors. So I'm not sure. I think I'll go with what the historians say, which is that Hunt was an explorer there. But that's kind of a very quick overview of some of the things that I've seen there and learned. And we'll have a chance to ask more questions and talk about it in a little bit, but we'll move on.
Well, thank you, Teresa. So how about we begin by having each of our panelists just talk a little bit about what sparked your interest in this topic, how you approach your research, your work, what interested you in it.
Well, first I will talk about the topic a little bit, and then I'll talk about how I got interested. Fort Missoula as a detention camp really began in 1941, but the genesis for it began in 1939. That's when the war broke out in Europe, and there were many ships detained at that point in United States ports, and these were ships that belonged to the Axis powers, and they were not able to go back to Europe, so they were stuck in the ports with all of these crews on the ships. And among those crews were a lot of Italians. When the United States began the Lend-Lease program with Britain, the governments of these German and Italian, primarily cruise ships, ordered the crews to begin to sabotage the ships so that they couldn't be used in the Lend-Lease program. And the United States government then took the ships over and removed the crews and brought them to Ellis Island. Well, in early 1941, they determined that they were going to bring the Italian crews from Ellis Island to Fort Missoula. And the reason they decided that Fort Missoula at the time was used as a civilian conservation corps camp, and so it was available, had barracks that would house 2,000 men. So in May of 1941, thank you, they brought the first of the Italian crews by railroad, and they landed at the fort. So this was before we got into the war. And by the end of May in 1941, they had about 1,000 Italian seamen in particular. And they were put into little sort of governmental units. They elected a mayor, and they had jobs to do, and they were paid a small wage to do those jobs, and they interacted with the community. They put on plays. Some of them were from a luxury ship called the Conte Biancamano, which was stuck in the Panama Canal Zone, and so they were really quite accomplished artists and musicians, etc. So they entertained the Missoula community, and they actually were quite happy to be here, because if they weren't here and they were back in Italy, they would have to be fighting in the war, and most of them had no interest in doing that. Particularly the merchant seamen, they had been traveling all over the world, many of them for many years, and they were really not interested in fighting in the war. So that's how the Italians came to be here. But starting on December 7th, the Japanese were arrested, and these were people who were put on what was called the government ABC list. Government determined which Japanese living in the United States they thought were most likely to be disloyal. These people were the most influential people in their communities. They were newspaper people, they were preachers, they were successful business people. They were also fishermen, because they thought they would have access to, when they were going out to sea, that they might have access to people who were interested in sabotage. So the U.S. government started arresting all of these people on December 7th, and because Fort Missoula already was in operation, they decided to send about 1,000 of these Japanese men, all men, to Fort Missoula. You have to know that these were all what they called aliens, because they were barred by law from becoming United States citizens. So they had immigrated here, but they couldn't become U.S. citizens. So they were brought to Fort Missoula, beginning to arrive about December 18th and into January. And the government decided that they were going to hold hearings for them. And it was interesting, because they were the only Japanese that had any kind of loyalty hearings whatsoever. As Teresa was talking about the 120,000 Japanese that were moved off of the West Coast, those people didn't have any hearings. But before all of that happened, which began starting in March of 1942, these Japanese were brought to Fort Missoula, and they decided to hold loyalty hearings. And so they brought to Missoula representatives from their communities, usually prominent business people, and they put them through these loyalty hearings. And I'm sure Diane is going to talk to you about the courtroom out there where they held the hearings. They also had some Missoula people as hearing officers, because there were so many Japanese in particular from California, but also Washington and Oregon, that they couldn't hold hearings quickly enough for them. So they had some Missoula people, including Dean Leapart from the law school and Mike Mansfield, who, of course, at that time was teaching in the history department. And they held the hearings for these people to try to determine whether they were likely to be disloyal, which is, I think, a pretty hard thing to determine. But the hearing boards were to decide whether these people should remain in detention. And so they brought them to the courtroom, and they had all the information that they had gathered through surveillance before the war began, and trying to determine whether they thought these people would commit acts of sabotage, or perhaps more likely, because they were so influential in their communities, that they would influence other people to commit acts of sabotage. So they held hearings throughout the winter and spring. Depending on whether I have time, I'll talk about a few specific things, but they held the hearings and then turned over their findings to the Justice Department, and that was to determine whether they would be released or not. Well, in the meantime, Roosevelt identified what he called the Western Defense Command, and it was a military designation, as Teresa mentioned, and the military, a guy named General DeWitt, could decide what to do with all the Japanese in that Western Defense Command. Well, he decided they were all going to be moved. So rather than have any kind of question that these people would be released, what they decided is that some of them might be able to join their families in these War Relocation Authority camps. There were 10 of those. The Missoula camp was a Justice Department camp. It's different than the WRA camps. So they started moving the Japanese out of Fort Missoula beginning about in June of 1942. Many of them, however, were not allowed to rejoin their families. They were sent to places like Lordsburg in New Mexico, or Fort Stanton in Oklahoma. Ultimately, many of them who were not released were ended up in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And many of those people were not released until up to 6 months after the war. And there's some really sad stories, and if I have time, I'll tell you about one particular person. If you want to read about this person in depth, Lauren Kessler is here at the book festival, and she is reading from her book Stubborn Twig, which is about the Yasui family of Hood River, Oregon, and it's a fabulous book. I really highly recommend it. And but the Yasuis were really important in Fort Missoula history, but also in the history of Japanese relocation. The father, Masuo Yasui, was a prominent businessman in Hood River, and he was the most prominent Japanese businessman there. It was a heavily Japanese community because it was an orchard. They had a lot of orchards, so it was a place where a lot of Japanese immigrants had come to settle. But he was a prominent businessman. He was the head of the Apple Growers Association. He was in the Rotary Club. The Apple Growers was not just a Japanese association. So he had a son named Minoru Yasui, who got the first law degree at the University of Oregon. But when he graduated in 1941, he wasn't able to find work. So his father contacted the newly created Japanese consulate in Chicago and inquired about whether there might be a position for his son, and he was hired right away. Well, as soon as Pearl Harbor happened, his father sent a telegram to the son to say, it's important that you resign from the Japanese consulate and that you return and join the military. Well, the son had already had a ROTC commission, so he did resign. He returned and tried to join the military. They rejected him for reasons no one knows that I have heard of. So he decided, because he was an attorney, that he was going to defy the curfew laws that the government imposed before they moved all the Japanese off the West Coast. So he went down to the police station in Portland and said, I'm defying the curfew. So they arrested him and put him in solitary confinement for 2 months. But I should sort of a little bit circular here. Before that happened, he came out to Fort Missoula to help his father in the hearing that his father had. The hearing was a complete farce. There's sort of some excerpts in my book that Min, the son, had written about the kinds of questions that they asked him in the hearing. But clearly from the records it shows that the father was detained because the hearing board resented the fact that the son was what they called arrogant and crafty and was really trying to, protect his father's legal rights. But you can see from the documentation that they have out at Fort Missoula now that was very hard to come by, that the father was detained really because the son was exercising his civil rights. So the father was detained till 6 months after the war. He was never permitted to go back to Hood River. That was one of the conditions of his release. He was never permitted to go back to Hood River. So he went back to Portland. He ultimately became an American citizen when, after the war, the Japanese were permitted to become American citizens, but he was so despondent he ultimately killed himself. So the Japanese had a fairly unhappy experience, in contrast with the Italians, who had a fairly happy experience at Fort Missoula. They were here during the entire time that we were at war with Italy, but when Italy surrendered, then the Italians were allowed to do things like work out in the community. They worked for the Forest Service, they worked at the Florence Hotel, they worked as gardeners, they intermingled quite a bit with people in the community, and when they were finally repatriated, they had the option of joining the United States military, and then they could apply for citizenship. So we had several Italians stay in the community, and a lot of people know some of them. Alfredo Cipolato, who had the Broadway Market. A lot of people I know knew Alfredo, and Umberto Benedetti, who's still here. So they were able to come back and stay, but most of the Italians ended up going back to Italy after the war was over. And one of my favorite stories I like to tell, which is when the train came to take the Italians back, there was a report in the newspaper about how many women were standing on the platform screaming and crying because they had developed these relationships with these guys, and in fact, some of them found out for the first time that they had the same boyfriend. So they're and so they had quite a different experience here. Some of them, I actually had a woman several years ago call me from Seeley Lake to say that her father, she found out much later, had been an Italian internee at the fort, who she never met till she was an adult because he had been repatriated back to Italy. So it was an interesting experience, but very different from the Japanese from the Italians. So that's my...
Now, Carol, you mentioned the hearings that were held at Fort Missoula. Diane, maybe you can talk a little bit about the museum's acquisition of Building T1 and what that's really going to mean for telling this aspect of the history.
Well, let me back up and just say Carol's done just fabulous work on this history, and in fact, it's really the only thing that we have out there that tells you that whole story, or at least the beginnings of that story, because we continue to find new things out about this history pretty much every day when new people show up, or I bet there's someone in this audience who's going to come up to us and say, someone in my family had a relationship to this history that we didn't know about before. So it's an unfolding history, and I think that's one of the things that makes it such an interesting thing to work on, is that it's not something that people know very much about. How many of you have ever been out to Fort Missoula and seen any of this? Oh, good. Hooray. Fort Missoula, the Historical Museum, I think is really incredibly fortunate to be located where it's at. It is a county museum, and we have 32 acres on the grounds of Fort Missoula. And as part of that, we have for a long time known about the use of the grounds out there as an internment camp during World War II. But When the University of Montana decided to remove the housing barracks that many of these internees were in, the museum acquired one of the barracks for an interpretive site. And so if you come out there, you'll be able to look at one of the original barracks and the exhibits that are in there on both the Italian and the Japanese experience. And there's a small exhibit in the main museum as well. But about 4 years ago, when we were looking for additional space, we acquired a building just this last year that turns out to have been the post headquarters during this period. And it contains in it, on the second floor, the courtroom in which these hearings were held. Fort Missoula is a National Historic District. These buildings are on the National Historic Register, and the whole fort, for the large part, is intact. There were 4 major Department of Justice camps that Carol was talking about. Here, Fort Lincoln in Bismarck, Santa Fe, where I was just at, and that camp no longer exists. It's underneath a subdivision, and Crystal City in Texas. So this camp is extremely unique in all the United States in that it exists, it's still in place, it's still largely in use. In fact, the first barracks that was used by the Italians, you all know, as the Lolo National Forest building out there. The hospital is the Western Montana Mental Health Center. So all of those buildings that you're looking out there have a history related to other things at the fort, but they have a particular, at this point, history related to World War II and the internment history out there. We're in the process of trying to secure National Historic Landmark status for Fort Missoula, largely because of this extremely unique history. There really is no other building like this courtroom in the United States and this post-headquarters building. So, and we didn't even know about the courtroom, really, until we started to acquire the building and look at the drawings and the blueprints and say, this is this courtroom on here, and tying it to the stories that Carol had found. So we are, I think, very fortunate as a museum both to have in our possession now a number of these original buildings. We have many, many records as well. We have artifacts of different kinds that you'll see in the exhibits if you come look at them. We have many students who come and do research at the museum about aspects of this. We're now working with about half a dozen university students, primarily from anthropology, on uncovering more of this history. And a year ago or so, we signed a memorandum of agreement with the University of Montana, some of you probably saw it in the paper, to further preserve and interpret all of Fort Missoula in terms of this history, and are looking forward to, for example, a conference in 2011 that will explore this history at the beginning of the 70th anniversary of World War II. There are other it's interesting who shows up and comes to us with stories. It was about 2 months ago that 3 of the children of one of the men who was, Japanese men who was held at Fort Missoula, showed up at our door unannounced, as they frequently do, and said my father was held here, and came and started telling us the stories of what had happened to him. And for the first time, we could show them the courtroom in which their father appeared before one of these hearings. That's a really powerful thing to be able to do, and to tell that story. And so the partnership also with the museum around the Shimamura exhibit, and you heard about the 5th grade experience where our Missoula area kids come and see this exhibit, learn something about this history, come out to the museum, and then see where it actually happened. Those are really powerful teaching tools because the story of what happened there is an important one for Americans to know and for us in Missoula to know. It's a hidden history. And it's one that is not just about the past, but one that we continue to deal with around, particularly when we're in panic mode as a country, when we're attacked, like after 9/11. I was at a conference where the real discussion was among the Arab American community, should we round up all the Arab Americans in the United States, similar to what we had done? And it was the Japanese American community that stood up and said, Senator Inouye, Senator Kaka, and all of them, best you think about this and what the consequences of that would be, because most of you probably don't know, but in 1988, as a result of decades of activism by the Japanese American community, the United States government and President Reagan, we issued an official recognition and apology to Japanese Americans for the mistake of this internment and paid reparations. So it's also part of the history that I think we need to understand as we deal with our own human emotions when we're under these kinds of situations. This is a very emotional story for people who were interned, the children and descendants, families of people who worked at the fort, and for all of us who continue to work on it. It's a very powerful story. So we are raising money for this project still. We were just honored by the National Park Service with a $50,000 grant to help start restoring that courtroom, and we need matching funds for that. I put these out on your desks or your chairs if you would like to be more involved. If you are a family of an internee or know someone who worked out there, you can sign on the dotted line in the back, or if you're just interested, and I'll put you on a mailing list about this project. But this is a I think it's the most important World War II site, certainly in Montana, and because of that courtroom, it is unique in the United States. So we're always thrilled when people come because they're interested in learning more about that history.
Well, thank you, Diane. You mentioned the emotional impact that this story has and just how deeply affected those who are involved with it have been. Teresa, what would you say the role of art is in retelling of this story, and how would you relate that to the this wonderful Shimamura exhibit that we're in now? What is the role of art in telling the story?
I think art can reach a different audience that may not be familiar with the story. And also, Roger has said that the work that he does is not a direct representation of what he's seen. It's in his artistic interpretation. And part of the challenge for me as a photographer is that I can't have artistic license. I can only show what is actually there. And so that's why I thought it was important to pair some of the old historic photos with my contemporary pictures. But I will also add that there were a lot of restrictions to the photographers who photographed these sites, and they could not, for example, show any barbed wire. They could not show the guard towers or any guns. And so, these pictures that are available aren't really truly representative of what was there. But again, I think the greatest benefit is that it reaches a different audience and tells a story in a way that people can just grasp a different dimension, I think, than just through the written text of history books.
Thank you.
Well, I do want to say that you got to see several of Teresa's photographs, but please don't leave without seeing the rest of her exhibit. And I really also suggest when you do that you read the captions that go with them, because she's done so much research on those, and it really gives you a real interesting and broad perspective about it.
And we do have hundreds of photographs, actually, of Fort Missoula, a lot from the University, the Historical Society, and people like some of you who are older remember Sheriff John Moe, who had worked as a guard out there, who had a fabulous collection of photographs that we've acquired, and people bring us different things from that. So we do have an amazing archive of photographs, original documents, and other kinds of artifacts about that experience.
And that's really interesting, because when I know you do, when I first started working on this, there was nothing. Fort Missoula had nothing. You couldn't find anything about Fort Missoula. The only place I found anything about it was to go back to the National Archives and read their files there. It was just one of those things that nobody knew about. Of course, some Missoulians knew something about if they had lived here during that time, but it really, there was a lot of fuzziness about it, and really just nothing was written about it at all.
And perhaps I could follow up on that, because I think we're still trying to settle our own confusions and being clear about it, because this is a Department of Justice alien detention camp. It does not hold families. It does not hold legal Americans. It is enemy aliens that, under the Enemy Alien Act, that are there. And we'd be remiss, I think, to not mention the fact there are also some Germans that are held there, German nationals, who are mostly held in North Dakota. And then another bizarre twist on this, which is the United States government went down the west coast of Central and South America and picked up a couple thousand Japanese leaders off those countries, brought them to the United States and held them for exchange for prisoners of war with Japan. And we have about 123 of those people who are also at Fort Missoula. So there are many layers of stories to be told about that experience.
When they brought those people from South America, again, they were generally the leaders of the community, and it was really, a lot of these things were real economic issues. The people who lived in those communities were resentful. The Japanese were economically successful. That was particularly true in California. The drumbeat against the Japanese was led by the Hearst newspapers, but in South America as well, it was really an economic issue. So when they brought those South American Japanese here, the United States government ordered that it be done, and then when they entered the country, they charged them with not having visas. And then the idea was that they were going to use them in exchange for American held in Japan. You know, I do want to say something. I think it's always interesting. Sometimes you get people who were veterans and still have a lot of anger about this. And you know, I think you have to sort of put it into context. And I always say, when you think about this rounding up of the Japanese and the Italians from in this other way, I mean, it's a terrible thing, and there really is no excuse for it. But if you put it in the context of the time, in early 1942, the war was going very badly for the United States, and people were very afraid. And that's not justification for doing that. And a lot of those Japanese that were moved were American citizens. But there's, I occasionally, hear people and they're really sort of resentful and saying, well, look at what the Japanese did to the Americans. I mean, Ben Steele was just here with his drawings from the Bataan Death March, etc. Well, they did terrible things, but that doesn't mean that it was okay for us to do terrible things. And we did do some terrible things, and there was mistreatment. And in some of the WRA camps, people died. So at the time when we were doing those things, we also didn't really know what Japan was doing with prisoners of war. So, I don't think there's any excuse for it. And I think we have to remember about what our country stands for, and the civil liberties that really are critical to who we are. And as Diane said, that goes for today. I used to talk to groups about this, and people would ask me, do you think this could ever happen again? And I would say, boy, I think we've really learned a lesson. And then, of course, 9/11 happened, and obviously we really didn't learn a lesson. I think our memories are pretty short, but it shows what happens when people are afraid. And this was one of those episodes, and I'm sure we'll probably have more to come.
Well, now, Diane, you mentioned the numerous levels and the different layers of this story. What do I suppose all three of you really see as the potential for future research and really the important aspects of this story that remain to be told?
I could write a new edition of this book about every year, I think. When I first started doing it, there really wasn't much, as I said. It was all, I've been through every record at the National Archives, but as Diane said, people keep coming forward, and there's more information all the time. So I think there's really a lot left to be written, a lot left to learn about it. And as the Historical Society's work and the Fort Museum's work gets more widely known, I think we're going to only get more people who come forward with stories to tell. The thing that's difficult, and Teresa can speak to this, but what I found it extraordinarily difficult is finding people whose fathers had been here, because the average age was 60 years old in 1942 of the Japanese men who were detained here. Not so with the Italians, but that was for the Japanese. So really, when I was trying to find out more information, I really wanted to know, who were these people? Who were they as people, and what were their families like? And I did find a lot of family members. I went to some reunions of some of the WRA camp people, but they didn't know very much because it wasn't talked about. They went back home and they didn't talk about it. It's just like Teresa mentioned that, she grew up with children whose mother was detained there, and they didn't talk about it because it was behind them, and they thought in some ways that it was thought to be shameful, just not because they'd done anything wrong, but that people people pointed fingers at them and they talked about them and they just didn't want to talk about it. So finding out information from the children of these people who were at the camps was very difficult. Sometimes they have letters, and that's about the extent of it.
Just that Carol's point about the age of people is a problem. The people that I've met that are in their 60s and 70s were young children or maybe even just born in the camp, and so they have very few memories. And the older people are dying all the time that I've met, and some that I've wanted to talk to but didn't get to in time. And only a couple have been reluctant to talk. I really think that the government apology and the reparation payments have made a huge difference in people feeling more comfortable about talking about this. Again, when I was growing up in Idaho, no one ever talked about it, including my parents. And so it was something that, I just didn't learn about. And so this has been a great opportunity for me to speak to these people firsthand, to hear their stories and try and document, not all of them, but certainly as many as I can. And the Densho Project in Seattle is doing a tremendous job. If any of you are interested in looking at other stories, it's densho.org, but they've received a number of different grants to continue doing oral histories and videotaping subjects on this topic and other topics related to that period of our history.
Yeah, and I would say there are a lot of sources these days, but trying to hook them all together, like the Densho Project's great, and then the Japanese American National Museum doing this big conference. And I was so amazed to see there were about 2,500 Japanese there, and who would bring their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren and refer to it as a pilgrimage to go to a camp and see where this had happened. But of course, because there are not families here, they're only individual men who are here mostly for relatively short lengths of time. There isn't the same family attachment to Fort Missoula that there is to the others. And I took Carol's book, and in the first edition there's a list of a number of the Japanese men, and I said to one of the young guys I was sitting with, "So was your grandfather at Fort Missoula?" He said, "Oh, no." And I said, "Well, look at the list. Just look. My God, there's his name right there." And we were looking through it, and there's a picture of some artwork. One of the things, people did a lot of artwork of different kinds out at the fort, whether it was painting or making ships or all of the arts and community things, symphonies and things. But a number of the Japanese men found pebbles out on the river and polished them and turned them into art objects of different kinds. And so he looked at this picture of this vase and he went, "We have two of those at home. We had no idea where they came from." So there are unidentified things out there as well. So the Densho collection, I think, is really important, and that thanks for computers and databases, these projects can now all be linked up in different ways that really wasn't possible very practically even 10 years ago between these different ones. And a lot of this material is still only recently being declassified. I mean, 1997 for a lot of the National Archives stuff. So it's really fairly recent that legally some of this has become available. And then weird places, I was giving a talk on this during the legislature at the Historical Society. Many of those people are here. And a woman came up to me and she said, "I'm the archivist over at the Diocese of the Catholic Church, and we have a folder on this topic, and there are like 200 and some documents in there, including the Pope had been sending allowances, basic Christmas gifts to the Italian internees here, and had sent money for a radio, and was arranging marriages with guys who were here with women back in Italy, and fascinating files. Anyway, so these new documents show up fairly regularly. What was the role of the Catholic Church in terms of this? If any of you are university students or looking for projects, research projects, there are many wonderful things to be explored with the resources that we now have available that we haven't had a chance to look at before.
Well, I think we're down to about 5 minutes here, so maybe we can open up the floor to questions. And
it seems that the history is very related to the individual. They can't hear you anywhere else. It seems that the history is very much individualized. So what happened at Heart Mountain by Cody is not known up here, but it's close to here, and Minidoka is close to here, and Topaz, which is southwest of Salt Lake City in the middle of nowhere. those three locations have nothing. As you've explained, you have quite a bit here to work with, and not much has been done there. But those are accessible places. But I want people to know that have an interest here that Manzanar, which is just west of Death Valley and on the back side, the east side of Mount Whitney, our highest mountain outside of Alaska in the United States. Manzanar had a big building that was like a gymnasium type building, and it's been turned into a Smithsonian quality museum. It's an astonishing museum and picture of this history with excellent bookstore and resources. And so if any of you are ever down in that area between Death Valley and the backside of those mountains, be sure and go to Manzanar. And Carol, I just wanted to emphasize what you already mentioned, the personal story she told of the Japanese gentleman from Hood River, that she has a few pages in her book in the bigger picture of here. The individual story of that family is in the book she mentioned, Stubborn Twig, and that woman who's written this book is coming here to the Art Museum at 1 tomorrow, and I bought this morning and spent a few hours looking at it, and it's an astonishing story, and that personal story fills out the richness in a way that goes along with and parallels what you're doing out at the fort. So thank you.
Yes.
Just a question about the hotel that stored all the personal belongings. Did most of those people not come back because they weren't allowed to go back to that area, or why do they think they just left them and never reclaimed them?
They don't know for sure, but many of the people did not return to Seattle. I mean, a number did, but I've met many people who never went back. I mean, maybe to visit families, but not to live permanently. So I think they just didn't think to go collect their possessions again.
Where did they go?
One of the government's goals was to disperse the people because they tended to congregate into, small, tight communities like Nihonmachi and Seattle. And I think one of their goals was integration, which they were quite successful with. And one of the people in the slideshow, Robert Hosokawa, lives in Winter Park, Florida. And he was one that never went back to Seattle. A couple of the people in those pictures did go back to Seattle, but I photographed people all over the place: Missouri, California, Florida was the farthest place, but they're everywhere. New York State, many different locations. Yes, there are a number of people cited the bad memories, and they just didn't want to return.
Carol, I wondered if you'd talk a little more about Mike Mansfield's role, because when I read your book, I found it rather disturbing.
Well, there really isn't a lot known about Mansfield's role, actually, because when he was asked about it years later, I actually had written him while he was still ambassador to Japan, and I didn't get an answer, which is a little bit unusual. And then Don Oberdorfer, who was a journalist for the Washington Post, did a terrific biography of Mansfield and asked him about it at the time, because he and I had conversed, and Mansfield said he didn't recall. And, if you know Mansfield, I think maybe he did or he didn't, but it was a long time ago. But I do think that, we can't necessarily say that, he did something bad, because I have not found any records yet, and I've tried every way I could think of, Freedom of Information Act, et cetera, requests, but I haven't found anything that shows his name as one of the people on the board, and how he voted, whether he voted to have these people be paroled, or whether he voted to have them detained, or any questions that he might have asked. So I don't think we can really say what his role was. I'm sure he was asked to serve, and he agreed to do so, but how he saw that, or how that played out, that's unfortunate. We just don't really know.
And that was the period just before he was elected to Congress for the first time. But the other thing was, as I look at a lot of the transcripts, like one of the transcripts is there's a standard set of questions these guys were asked, and then there are, in the transcript record, it'll say who was in the room. What's interesting, it says who was the interpreter, which are these Korean guys, and it lists certain other people, but it never says on those, not one that I've ever found, who exactly was on that hearing board in each individual case, which I don't know why not. Everyone else is listed there, but they don't specifically say that. But it was quite a shock, I can tell you, when I went to this big national conference and mentioned that Mansfield had served on these, given the way most Japanese view Mike Mansfield, to realize he served on these committees was. But there are other heroes. I think one of the things I found when I read Carol's book was the role of the president of the university. Do you want to mention that? Because I think it's important to remember people who did something about it in a different way.
Sure. Ernest Melby was the president then, and he proposed that the Japanese that were being moved off the West Coast that were in colleges there, some of those would be allowed to come to school at what was then Montana State University. But a lot of people got really upset about this, and including some fairly prominent Missoulians who were saying that if they did it, there would be hell to pay because people would see this as substituting these students for students who ended up going off and fighting in the war. So there was, the Board of Education took up the issue in the spring, but kept delaying it and delaying it and delaying it so that it never happened. But Melby really thought that that was a right and just thing to do, but he could never get the Board of Education to agree to it.
Okay, well, thank you so much to Diane and Carol. And thank you to the Art Museum, the Historical Museum of Fort Missoula, and the University of Montana, and for all of you for coming
And if
spending
you
your
would
time with
like
us.
to buy a book, Carol will be over in the corner signing books. If you didn't get one of these handouts and would like them, I'd be glad to give you one.